When it comes to line and wash, there's more than one way to skin a cat. You know, the line and wash cat, as it were. I don't skin cats, okay? No cats were harmed in the filming of this episode. Hello minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Well, I'm going to do a comparison for you today just to show you the range of line and wash and how you can use it along with watercolor. Line and wash is just a great way to do watercolor, and I'm going to do a tightly rendered, highly shaded version of the ink, and then I'm going to do one which is a little more minimal with the ink and heavier with the watercolor. And you can actually do all kinds of combinations or ranges in between that. But I'm just going to show you my approach and two ways that I've used quite often, how they differ, and maybe give you some ideas on how you can approach line and wash. So let's jump right into it. What? You got a Halloween costume picked out already? Okay, great. Let's see it. Oh, nice. I like it. The Tin Man, huh? If you only had a heart, right? On to the line and wash comparison demo. Well, I've decided to start with a value study in pencil, and this is just really rough. I wanted also something, since I was going to transfer this drawing twice, that I could transfer from something that's a little more simplified. I did not print this image out, but I was going by an image, which you'll see pop up here in a minute. There it is. Nothing special about this. It's kind of a mundane image, but I was taken with the reflections, and I thought it would be a good piece to practice some pen and ink work with. So there's a close-up look at the rough value study, where again I just went through and simplified some of the values and gave me a little bit of a guide and something to transfer to my watercolor paper. And I decided to use Canson Hot Press, Canson Heritage, the new Canson Heritage, which is a tear-off pad here. In the hot press, and the hot press is just really great for ink, and it did do a really good job. I don't know that I've ever used Canson hot press for ink before, but I was real pleased. Had just enough tooth, but also very smooth to get a nice ink line. And I'm transferring the drawing for the two techniques directly with pen and ink. This top one, which is going to be the more highly rendered version with ink, I'm putting in the line just a little more deliberately and finitely, I guess you could say, definitively. In the bottom one, I'm using more of a, I guess, a dot dash, I don't know, sort of broken line. But here we're back to the top one, and I'm beginning the ink work now. And, you know, the ink work on this is a lot like watercolor or pencil. You start light, and you just work down into the darks. But I have enough of the line transferred so that I can get some idea of where I want my values, my deep shadows, and my lighter highlights. I started out with a liner, which is what I used to transfer a 0.1 01 micron liner, and I'm switching now to this zebra brush pen because I wanted a little heavier line, and I'm going to go ahead and put in some of the deepest values first. This trunk or these trees I'm going to almost completely blacken in. There'll be just a little bit of white space left, so I can maybe have some color show through. The zebra brush pen gets a fairly medium fine point, but you can press it down to get a fairly wide expressive stroke or variable stroke. And having these tree trunks in kind of helps me know how I want to weave the foliage in and out of them. But as I mentioned, this is going to be the more highly inked, highly rendered in ink version, and I'm going to do this to the point where it will stand alone as a pen and ink. And you'll see in my comments later, I kind of wish I had not colored most of it. I rarely go to the trouble or the extent of doing the ink work on a piece like this if I know I'm going to watercolor it. I'm going to go ahead and show you how I would do that, but usually if I go to all the trouble that I'm going to ink this one, I won't put that much color on it because I like being able to see that ink work. I think it's interesting. I think that's the beauty of it. When you start putting a lot of color in it, that gets obliterated. But for demonstration purposes, I did it anyway, and I'll talk more about that later. I started out wanting to do this with all vertical lines. Then I thought, no, I'm going to want to be able to turn my hatching this way and that. So before I got too deep into it, I started doing that, basically angling the hatching in different ways. I'm using a fountain pen. There are so many pens that would work great for this. A single liner like a Micron or a Copic single weight liner would work fine. I just really enjoy using a fountain pen. This is a new fountain pen that I got, and I know you're going to ask what it is. It's actually a custom-made fountain pen that I bought at a local craft market, maker's market. It's actually for young gentlemen, college-age gentlemen who make these to put themselves through school, and they just do a beautiful job. I loved this pen. I saw this pen, and it was like I was drooling over it, so I bought it. I've got Noodler's bulletproof black ink in there, so it will eventually dry, but it's slow to dry, and I ended up getting some smears on here. I should have used a slip sheet, but that's okay. It's just a study. Normally I'll use a slip sheet under my hand. Here you can see more what I'm talking about with the angled hatching. This is not the same as cross hatching, which cross hatching goes over a previous set of lines. This is just hatching angled in different ways. I think it's extremely interesting way to hatch. And I usually do that only where I'm putting in like mass texture. If there is forms to follow, I usually try to get the hatching to follow the forms. But I like to do hatching that goes in different directions, especially on foliage. And I'll even fan the hatching like a fan, especially for foliage. I think that works. I'm just going through, picking out lower values, deciding what's going to be what's going to be deeper, what's going to be highlight. I do this a lot like the way I approach watercolor. Even though pen and ink is tighter, more controlled, I still put down marks, fill in value, and then respond to what I put down before deciding what to do next. But I am putting value down mainly next to some of the lines that I transferred. And where there's linear detail, of course you add that in. Everything can lend to value. Closeness of your lines together, the weight of your line, the spacing, which is the closeness, the frequency, the hatching. I mentioned before, I think I mentioned this in the last elk video that I did. I don't do much cross hatching, and if you look at a lot of masters works, really good masters of pen and ink, you won't find a lot of cross hatching. You'll find some, but it's usually in the very deepest tones and usually on flat texture. I don't think cross hatching works very well, and it's funny because you talk to people about pen and ink and shading, and cross hatching is like the first thing that comes to mind. If you're shading everything on an equal texture on a flat surface, it's okay. I think cross-hatching is really kind of distracting, especially if it's widely spaced. And that's why I tend to only use it in deep values. You know, in that book review, as I said, that book review I did in the last video, if you look at some of those masters, you'll find it, but you won't find a lot of it. You'll find more parallel lines that vary the value by either spacing or weight. Now on the reflections, I'm going to go ahead and pin those in. Like I said, I'm treating this as though this were just going to be a pen and ink piece. The easiest way to approach reflections, whether it's in watercolor, pencil, is just to do vertical streaks. I don't mess around a lot with reflections. If I do them, I do this sort of soft focus approach, which is essentially vertical streaks. When water has micro ripples or a little bit of turbulence on the surface, that's what it'll look like. It'll look like everything is just streaking straight down, like running paint. I don't really get into doing mirror reflections. Those are hard to do and they're confusing to do. They look great in photography, but I don't mess with them a lot in either painting or pen and ink. So just in this case, in my reference, there was no mirror reflections. They all had these vertical kind of streaky reflections. So that's what I did anyway. I am trying to add a little bit of suggestion of the ripples in the surface of the water here. And this is pretty much done, ready for paint. And I would have been happy just to keep it that way or paint just a portion of it. But we'll go ahead and paint it all in. And when you do this much ink work on a line and wash, it basically almost paints itself. You just kind of dab the paint in and you're done. And again, you know, I added more paint to this really than I should have, but it is what it is. And I'm just trying to vary my greens. I'm throwing in some green gold. I used my core palette for this. Why? Well, I don't know. Why not? Just like I like core every now and then. Throwing in different colors, cool greens, some phthalo green, even a little phthalo blue here and there, some quinacridone gold, some green gold, sap green, just all kind of mixes. Even some red and a little bit of dioxazine purple here and there. Dioxazine purple mixes great with greens to give you sort of cool gray greens. Now I've completely wet the bottom, so I get some soft wet and wet streaks. So that's all I'm doing here. You didn't see it in the video, but I've completely wet that bottom area. So everything's going to be soft till it starts to dry. There's not a lot of rhyme or reason as to what part of these streaks are dark, but they do pick up some of the tones and colors that are on the bank. Just where like a really highlighted branch reaches down to the water, it's liable to reflect something brighter. But I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to that. I just, you know, kept the streaks varied in composition that looked interesting to me. So again, not a whole lot of painting to be done here. Just dips and dabs here and there. I think I ended up doing more than this later, but that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it on this top one. Now to the bottom one, and for some reason I didn't have the camera running for part of this, so you don't get to see a lot of the inking, but I didn't do much because this version is, you can see there was more of a scribble dot dash kind of broken line, and I only left myself enough ink to know where to put the paint. Basically, you'll get a look at where it ended up here in a minute. And I'm leaving more of the trunks open as I am everything else so that you can see more color when I add it in the tree trunks and branches. But just trying to get those popped in so I know where they are and where the foliage needs to relate to them. Now you can see what I didn't have on video. You can see how I ended up with the line work on this. A lot less hatching, a lot more open white space, so there's going to be more painting involved here. And I completely wet everything because I wanted a soft lay-in to begin with. So I'm wetting everything with a very yellowish green tone. I'm using a core green gold and some, I believe, some Indian yellow, just to tone everything. Getting it good and wet. I'm going to dab in some deeper tones, more mixes of green gold, sap green, occasionally phthalo green. I didn't mention it on the top one, but you know, you can paint when you have a fully inked piece like the top one. You can paint a little more vibrantly because all that ink line visually tends to mute it down if you're concerned about more natural greens and not like high vibrant greens. And as this foliage starts to dry, you know, I dab in smaller amounts that create harder edges. I think they're still spreading pretty softly at this point, but just going to work into those edges, the deeper values, and the contrast, the edge contrast. I'll end up switching brushes. This is actually a silver brush quill, one of the Atelier quills that I used to completely wet the background, and I was continuing to use it. That was a pretty good point, but as you can see, I've switched to this flat brush to start pulling in some of these deeper cool greens. This whole process is just really an exercise in balance, you know, deciding how much line work you want, deciding how much color you want. I'll mention this later, but this is really useful. This particular amount of line work is really useful for plein air sketching because it allows you to quickly capture a subject and maybe pop in some of the color and finish it back in the studio. I tend to go more this way. The top one, as I mentioned before, I tend to do more when I just want to see ink and I'm not planning on adding color. It'll be very limited. I think I said that already. I'm getting repetitive here, sorry. But it is important just to kind of assess, you know, the practicalities of a style that you might use, where you would use it, you know, why you would use it. There is a look, obviously, that might appeal to you more one way than another. I'm using some of the same techniques, but I'm paying more attention, of course, to how I render my values, because the ink is doing less of that work for me. Here you can see what I talked about earlier with leaving more of those trunks open. Whereas the top version was blacker, darker, more filled in with ink. This is not, so I got to fill it in with paint. It's a little more color in there. I'm adding a few water lines, I guess, just to kind of hint more at the surface of the water there. I can do that better with this one than I could with the more heavily inked version. At this point, it's just fussing, taking the values down, getting more color in there until I'm happy, tweaking it here and there. Alright, so I think I'll stop here, and this is a good long shot comparison so you can see them both. Definitely a different look. Both line and wash, as I've said. This has a bit of a grittier feel, linear feel, obviously. It's just interesting to me, though, how quickly one of these paint up. This is looking more like a traditional watercolor, still a line and wash. It's just a great, I think, plein air approach. I mean, it's a good approach anyway, but I love it especially for plein air because it allows you to quickly capture a subject, then do some of the detailing in line that shows through and stays showing through clearly as you add color, whereas pencil doesn't always. But obviously a lot more painting involved here to model the colors, and I could keep going. I mean, I could just keep working on that probably till I overworked it. But still it has a different look, a softer look, a more painted look. This has a more graphic look. But that's a look at two different line and wash techniques, both very valid, both interesting, both something very useful. And you can do any range of line and wash proportion in between them. A lot of options there. Hope y'all enjoyed that. Thank you everybody for watching. Hope you got something out of that and maybe some ideas that you want to try with your next line and wash. Thank you so much, patrons, for being sponsors of this channel, making this content possible, and we will see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.